You should know that Poilievre's technology over taxes will cost you more than the current carbon tax, and I'll show you what I mean by reviewing this video that he recently put out.
Canadians are paying more for foreign food rather than paying less for Canadian food. I will ask that.
So this first statement isn't exactly true. We showed that food costs from the carbon tax are really low in the last video, and these costs would likely be overshadowed by transportation costs from somewhere like Mexico, even without a carbon tax. If that is our concern, that domestic industries are being hurt by the carbon tax, then we should implement something like the carbon import tax that the EU is doing and Canada has talked about. This way, domestic markets are actually more competitive.
The tax to bring home lower gas, heat, and grocery bills. My plan on the
So axing the tax right now would technically reduce immediate costs on anything that it affects. It has a detrimental impact of increasing emissions and kicking the can down the road by making the negative consequences of carbon emissions worse for future generations. Future generations, which Poilievre very much cares about.
I'm just among the common people who are custodians of that freedom while we're alive. Edmund Burke said it's a contract between the dead, the living, and the yet to be born. And we're the living generation has the duty to pass on that inheritance. And that's what I see myself doing, is to rekindle that inheritance and pass it on to my kids, and so they can pass it on to their kids.
This reminds me of the man bear pig example in South Park.
environment is technology and not taxes. We need to greenlight green projects like nuclear power to reduce our dependence on coal, carbon capture and storage so that our oil and gas sector can put the carbon back in the ground where it came from, and we can become the lowest.
So here he mentions only nuclear power and carbon capture, but clearly he cares about reducing emissions. But why not mention the most impactful thing on reducing emissions, solar and wind? Now let's show that there's some nuance to what solutions we choose and how those impact power generation, capital costs, operating costs, and CO2 production. I'm going into this assuming that Poilievre's goal is to lower capital costs, lower the cost to the consumer, and minimize CO2 emissions, because that seems to be what he's alluding to in his statements. To analyze the costs, I use Lazard's analysis on levelized costs of renewable energy without subsidies. This ensures we're fairly comparing all the costs on a per kilowatt hour basis, and it reflects the same return on investment for each energy source. The study used 12% IRR. To give nuclear a bit of a better chance, though, I'm going to be using the IEA numbers as well alongside the Lazard numbers, since the Lazard ones are based off a nuclear power plant that was expanded a couple years ago, but ran into numerous problems and had over double its cost in overruns, and it was delayed by a number of years. So the IEA numbers come with a bit of an asterisk in North America because we haven't been able to build a cheap nuclear power plant in a very long time. When we look at carbon capture alone, we have to understand that it consumes additional electricity, so tacking them onto existing plants actually lowers our overall energy output. For the simplicity of this example, we just use 90%. The Lazard study and IEA have numbers of like max and min and things like that. I'm just going to be talking about the average though, as you can see in this giant table, where we have renewable costs at the top, followed by long line transmissions. Transmission costs add around 250 to 1,000 USD per kilowatt for the capital costs, and about $1 to $10 per megawatt hour for the operating costs. This is a good time to interlude about long line transmission and why it's so important to renewable energy. We know that on a local basis, the sun isn't always going to shine and wind always isn't going to blow, but when your grid can supply energy thousands of kilometers away, the intermittency concerns reduce substantially and the need for battery storage also reduces. Transmission losses are only about 3% per 1,000 kilometers anyway. This gives you layers of redundancy, meaning during the day you may get solar power from the Sonora Desert, and at night maybe the wind from Ontario will power Texas. This is broadly how the European model is working right now, and it's allowing them to have significant renewable penetration of 50% or more. Germany, with about 50% renewables, has higher grid stability than the States even. Then additionally, in the interim, we have the flexibility of ramping up natural gas and coal plants. That just bolsters the effectiveness of using renewables and then minimizing the fossil fuels that we do currently still have. This overall reduces GHG emissions. The data that I've shown in the table can all be scaled for comparability. In this example, I used $1 billion USD. So if you invest $1 billion, what outcomes are you going to get? Because the IRR is the same, now we can compare the differences in terms of energy output, cost of energy, and CO2 emissions. I know the tables are a little bit messy, so I'm going to show all of this data graphically so it's a little bit easier to parse. This first chart is just showing the price per kilowatt hour. As you can see, carbon capture increases the costs of coal and natural gas plants by 33% and 43% respectively. Solar and wind are extremely cheap options, even with transmission and battery costs. And nuclear is comparable as long as we're using the IEA case. Again, a big asterisk there. The total energy that we're showing includes the capacity factors, and natural gas is a clear winner here. But since Poilievre's goal is to reduce emissions, it's kind of irrelevant for this conversation. Natural gas, wind power with transmission costs, and then solar without transmission costs are all comparable in their production. The main difference being solar and wind are cheaper for the end user, even if they produce a little bit less energy than the natural gas. As the consumer of power, I think I would prefer that. CO2 emissions are shown on a linear scale and a logarithmic scale for better clarity. Retrofitting carbon capture onto existing plants still produces about 100 times the carbon emissions that renewables and nuclear do for the same price point, while no carbon capture is obviously orders of magnitude worse. If we scale these numbers down to a policy level, you'll see that for every $1 million a government or private investor spends, they'll get a certain amount of energy out along with an amount of carbon emissions. And this is where I take issue with Poilievre's carbon capture plan. It's just a bad investment in comparison. It both reduces our energy capacity and increases the total cost on the consumer. I'm not pro solar and wind because I'm a lefty. I like it because it's cost effective. Solar and nuclear have similar results with the IEA numbers, but let's be honest here. It's way easier to convince people to have a solar farm near them than a nuclear power plant. I wish it was different, I truly do. But if you're an investor and the results for a solar plant and a nuclear plant are basically the same, you're going to pick solar every time, just so you don't have to deal with the headache of nuclear and the potential for the cost to balloon out of control. The risk is just way too high. But I will throw a bone to nuclear where I do see its purpose. It has a very high potential to produce hydrogen at a low cost, especially compared to solar and wind electrolysis. This is through a system called high temperature steam electrolysis, HTSE. It's a really good niche for nuclear where it can not only produce power, but also produce hydrogen. And this would change the economic dynamics. Since Poilievre specifically mentions carbon capture and nuclear, they're good, but they work better as secondary roles, as I've shown, not really primary ones. You'd want to primarily focus on solar and wind, and then supplement nuclear and carbon capture on the edges. Even if you own a power plant, your best interest would actually be to build more wind farms near your property and then tone down your natural gas plant, because you reduce your carbon emissions, you produce more power, not less, and it's a cheaper, more competitive product. At the end of the day, the consumer is the one who's going to end up paying for the capital costs and the operating costs that are going to be imposed on these companies if Poilievre makes them implement carbon capture like he's saying. And if nuclear cost overruns go way too high and the plant is eventually built, that company is going to want to make their return on investment back, which again will increase the costs. Functionally, carbon capture at 90% is equivalent to $94 per ton Canadian. So he's going to axe the tax just to implement a solution that's actually more costly than the tax currently is. Because of all the exemptions, a natural gas power plant might only be paying $7 to $15 Canadian per ton. Forcing them to implement carbon capture immediately bumps that up to $94. We covered this in my last video. So you might pay a little bit less for the natural gas to heat your home and 0.3% less on your grocery bill, but the power costs and gasoline costs are going to go up substantially, 42% in the case of natural gas. Since he wants low carbon oil, all of those refinery costs are also going to be included in your pump costs. At the end of the day, you just get lower emissions, lower consumer costs, and equal or better energy production with solar and wind, even when you're including battery storage and long line transmissions. There's clearly a space for carbon capture and clearly a space for nuclear, but if you're making that your primary objective in terms of technology instead of taxes, you're actually coming up with a worse result.
Most emitting source of oil anywhere on planet Earth. Oil, by the way, will be used roughly 60 to 100 million barrels a day for the next 2 decades, if you believe the International Energy Agency.
Yeah, that's true, but we don't want it to be true. That's the issue, is we want to decarbonize faster. We want to beat the IPCC targets. We want to beat the IEA estimates, right? The lower carbon, the lower oil, the lower coal, and all of these things that we produce, the better outcomes we're going to get for future generations and for ourselves.
So we think it should be low emitting Canadian oil to bring home that money to Canada. We need to.
If you add carbon capture and you have low emitting oil, you've essentially just added a $70 USD carbon tax or $95 carbon tax in Canadian dollars, making it actually more expensive than the current oil production that we have because of all the exemptions in our country. You see how this compounds into making his technology over taxes actually a lot more expensive than taxes.
Green light tidal wave power off the East Coast, like the one that Trudeau killed in Nova Scotia. We need to green light Quebec's plan to double its hydroelectric capacity. We can't afford 5 or 6 years of federal red tape blocking hydroelectric dams that are going to be necessary to supply the kilowattage to power an electric economy.
So he's right. There's a lot of government bureaucracy and nonsense that slows down and increases the cost of development and trying to get a lot of these projects green lit. A perfect example is housing, where things like parking minimums, height restrictions, and per unit taxes make it cost preventative to actually build these things or make them take a lot longer. As long as we maintain good regulations like ecological care and safety, I think that this is a broadly good plan as we need to decarbonize as rapidly as possible. I just think his effort would be better spent greenlighting solar and wind projects and long line transmission because that gives you more bang for your buck.
Justin Trudeau and the NDP want to raise the cost of traditional energy that we still need. I want to lower the cost of carbon-free alternatives. That's the
So as I've shown, it's actually your plan, Pierre, that will raise the cost of traditional energy by making them implement these costly technologies that has to be passed on to the consumer. This makes the carbon tax actually less expensive since it works on the free market dynamics rather than on government directives. Furthermore, the carbon tax has consistently been shown to either have no effect or a slightly positive effect on GDP while also reducing emissions. This makes sense since renewable energy is cheaper and infrastructure spending is generally good for the economy. The best quote that I've seen about carbon pricing is from MIT, where they say, "Many economists and policymakers consider carbon pricing one of the best available tools to combat climate change. That's because carbon pricing can touch every part of the economy, from electricity to manufacturing to transportation, and because it rewards any behavior that reduces greenhouse emissions. Rather than regulating exactly where and how emissions should be reduced, carbon pricing gives markets the flexibility to find the cheapest ways to lower emissions." So it's not really common sense on what he's proposing. It's actually counter to what most economists see on the subject. It'll end up being more costly and get us a worse result in terms of carbon emissions. That's just bad economics.
fundamental change that I propose. It's common sense. Let's bring it home.
So Pierre clearly believes climate change is real, and he wants to make a difference. Unfortunately, it doesn't line up with reality, and his policy decisions will cost Canadians more money, not less. Maintaining the carbon tax while doing things that he said, like removing red tape, will provide better outcomes at a lower cost. Being pro-carbon tax, or solar or wind, shouldn't be some partisan issue. The Liberals are allowed to have good ideas as much as they're allowed to have bad ideas. We should like policies because they're good economic decisions or good for the country, and this brigade against the carbon tax seems like a way to stir up voters, but doesn't actually address the problems we want to fix, and the statements he makes on the carbon tax are broadly untrue. But overall, his plan isn't terrible. It's a step backwards, but it's not the worst thing in the world. I just think his plan would be a lot better if he focused on solar and wind, and then made carbon capture and nuclear secondary objectives. I think it's important to have a dialogue between liberals and conservatives, so if you disagree with me or agree with me, come and jump into my Discord and I'll be happy to discuss any of these topics in further detail. Otherwise, all the references will be in the description. Thanks for watching.